Step away from my father. You are just a nurse. Richard Sterling's voice sliced through the private intensive care suite, sharp enough to silence every monitor except the steady rhythm of the heart machine. Naomi Brooks did not move. The soft fluorescent lights reflected across the polished floor as warm air drifted from the ceiling vents, carrying the sterile scent of antiseptic and fresh linen. Her fingers remained lightly wrapped around the elderly man's wrist, counting every fragile beat. Richard strode forward in his tailored charcoal suit, expensive shoes striking the tile with hard, echoing clicks. His jaw tightened. His blue eyes never left the black nurse standing beside the hospital bed. Around them, specialists, executives, and security officers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared interrupt. Richard had donated an entire cardiac wing to this hospital. When he spoke, people obeyed. "Did you not hear me?" he snapped. "Move." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes. They were calm, tired from another 12-hour night shift, yet strangely unwavering. She had spent 3 nights caring for the man everyone else saw as the billionaire's dying father. She knew every rise and fall of his breathing, every tiny movement beneath the blankets, every faint squeeze of his fingers that the machines could not explain. "Sir," she said quietly, "please give me 1 minute." Richard laughed once, cold and humorless. 1 minute? He looked around the room as if inviting everyone to enjoy the absurdity. "You think 1 minute changes anything?" A nervous smile flickered across one executive's face before disappearing. No one else reacted. Naomi lowered her gaze again. The old man's eyelids did not open, but something in his breathing shifted. Barely noticeable. Barely real. Richard caught her watching the monitors. Enough. He stepped closer until only inches separated them. "The best neurologists in the country have already given me the facts. My father is gone." Naomi remained silent. The overhead lights hummed softly. Somewhere beyond the glass doors, an elevator chimed. Rubber saws squeaked across distant hallways. Inside the room, the only steady sound was the electronic pulse repeating through the silence. Richard folded his arms. "Do you know who I am?" Naomi answered without looking at him. "Yes." "Then you know I do not repeat myself." She finally met his eyes. There was no fear in hers, only compassion that somehow irritated him even more. "I know exactly who you are," she replied. "But right now, you are about to make a decision you cannot take back." The room grew still. One physician slowly lowered the clipboard in his hands. Even the security guard hesitated before taking another step forward. Richard felt heat rising beneath his collar. How dare she challenge him in front of everyone? "Doctor," he said, never breaking eye contact with Naomi, "remove her from this room." No one moved. The attending physician swallowed hard. "Mr. Sterling, technically she is assigned to your father's care." Richard's stare hardened. "Not anymore." Naomi inhaled slowly. The warmth of the old man's hand lingered against her fingertips. She leaned closer, so close that only he could hear her. Richard frowned, expecting another plea, another apology, another desperate excuse to keep her job. Instead, her voice became barely more than a whisper. "He still hears you." Richard's expression did not change. Not at first. Then every trace of color drained from his face. His hand loosened around the consent folder. The papers slipped slightly. A memory he had buried years ago crashed back without warning. His father's voice. Those exact 4 words. Spoken on the worst day of his life. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm as every person in the room watched the billionaire standing perfectly still. Then, from the hospital bed, one finger moved. The tiny movement lasted less than a second, but Naomi felt it before anyone else did. Her fingertips caught the faint curl of the old man's index finger, warm against her palm. The heart monitor kept its steady rhythm, yet something invisible had shifted inside the room. Richard stared at his father's hand, then shook his head. "Reflex," he said quickly, almost to himself. "It has to be." The attending urologist stepped closer, his polished shoes whispering across the glossy floor. He examined the hand, then the monitor, then Naomi. He did not answer. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Richard's breathing grew uneven. He had built billion-dollar companies by trusting facts, numbers, contracts, never feelings. But facts were refusing to cooperate. Naomi remained beside the bed, her shoulders relaxed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Talk to him." Richard looked at her with open disbelief. "You expect me to believe he can hear me? I expect you to give him a reason to stay." Richard laughed again, but there was no confidence left in it. Outside the glass wall, nurses had quietly stopped walking. 2 respiratory therapists watched without speaking. Even security no longer seemed certain why they were standing there. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though the air itself had become heavier. Richard glanced toward the consent papers resting on the counter. One signature. One final decision. His hand trembled before he shoved it into his pocket. Naomi leaned closer to the patient again. "Mr. Sterling," she said gently, "your son is here." Nothing happened. Richard exhaled sharply, relief beginning to return. "Enough," he muttered. "This has gone far enough." He turned toward the physician. "Finish the paperwork." Before anyone moved, a faint crackling sound filled the room. The old speaker attached to the bedside monitor activated for just an instant as the patient's breathing changed. Then another finger moved. This time everyone saw it. A nurse near the doorway covered her mouth. The neurologist stepped closer, shining a penlight across the patient's eyes. His pupils reacted. Richard's heartbeat pounded loudly in his own ears. "That is impossible," one specialist whispered. Naomi never looked surprised. She simply nodded as though she had been waiting for the room to catch up. Richard turned toward her, confusion replacing anger. "How did you know?" She hesitated. For the first time since entering the room, uncertainty crossed her face. "Because," she began softly, "he has been trying to answer every time you visit." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" Naomi swallowed. "Every night after you left, I read him the notes you never finished saying out loud." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The unfinished conversations. The apologies he could never bring himself to speak. The words he whispered only after believing his father was too far gone to hear them. Naomi looked toward the bed again. He cried. Richard's eyes snapped toward her. "That is not possible." "Not tears you could see," Naomi answered quietly. "His blood pressure changed every single time you said you were sorry." The neurologist slowly lowered the penlight. "Mr. Sterling," he said carefully, "I think we need to postpone everything." Richard stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. His father had heard him. Every regret. Every lie. Every apology spoken too late. Then the old man's lips trembled again. The room leaned closer. A dry breath escaped. Barely audible. Barely human. But unmistakably directed at only one person. "Richard!" The billionaire closed his eyes as tears finally gathered. Then the old man struggled to force out one more sentence, and Naomi's expression changed instantly, because she realized someone else had been listening all along. The room held its breath. Every eye locked onto the old man as his lips trembled again, but before another word could escape, the heart monitor erupted into a rapid warning tone. Red lights flashed across the screen, bathing polished steel rails and white walls in a pulsing crimson glow. Nurses rushed forward. Rubber saws skimmed across the floor. Richard instinctively reached for his father, but Naomi stepped between them without raising her voice. "Do not touch him." Richard stared at her in disbelief. "You think you can give me orders? If you want him to keep fighting, yes." Her answer was calm enough to sting. The specialists hesitated. One reached for medication, but Naomi's eyes were already fixed on the monitor. "Wait." The physician frowned. "Nurse Brooks, this is not your call." She never looked away from the patient. "His heart is not failing." The warning alarm continued to pulse through the room. "He is responding." Richard shook his head, frustration boiling over. This is exactly why people should stay in their lane. The words echoed through the suite. Several staff members lowered their eyes. Naomi absorbed the insult without flinching. She had heard worse during 12 years on hospital floors where people remembered titles long before names. She simply leaned closer to the old man again. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered. "If you hear me, squeeze once." Nothing happened. Richard let out a bitter breath. Enough. His confidence returned for a brief moment. "You built everyone's hopes on a coincidence." Then, slowly, the old man's hand closed around Naomi's fingers. Once. Deliberately. Audible gasps rippled through the room. The neurologist froze with the penlight still raised. One resident instinctively reached for his phone before thinking better of it. Richard stood perfectly still, unable to blink. Naomi nodded gently, as though greeting an old friend. "Thank you," she whispered. The old man's grip relaxed. Richard stepped forward. "Dad?" There was no response. "Dad, it is me." Silence. The hope that had exploded only seconds earlier began slipping away. Richard looked at Naomi with desperation replacing pride. "Why did he answer you but not me?" Naomi hesitated. The fluorescent lights reflected across the tears beginning to form in Richard's eyes. She could have stayed silent. Instead, she spoke carefully. "Because he has already heard your voice." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" Naomi inhaled slowly. "Every night after your visits ended, he whispered the same sentence." Richard felt his pulse quicken. "What sentence?" She looked directly into his eyes. "He kept saying, 'My son thinks I cannot hear him.'" Richard's knees nearly gave way. Memories crashed together. Every confession spoken beside the bed. Every conversation he believed was private. Every apology delayed until it felt safe. Across the room, the attending physician quietly reviewed the overnight nursing logs. His brow tightened. "These entries," he murmured. "Who documented these responses?" Naomi answered softly. "I did." He turned page after page. Tiny pupil changes. Finger pressure. Heart rate spikes. Consistent. Precise. Night after night. He looked up slowly. "Why was none of this escalated?" Before Naomi could answer, another voice broke the silence. "Because I ordered them ignored." Every head turned toward the doorway. Hospital Administrator Charles Whitmore stood beneath the cold hallway lights, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. Richard stared at him. "What did you just say?" Whitmore stepped inside without hurry, the sound of his leather shoes echoing across the floor. He looked at Naomi as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience. "I warned her to stop filling families with false hope." Naomi lowered her eyes for only a second. "You told me to erase the notes." Whitmore's face hardened. "And yet you kept writing them." Richard slowly turned toward the administrator, then back to Naomi. The room had become so silent that even the faint hiss of oxygen through the tubing sounded deafening. Then the old man's hand lifted again, weaker than before, and with trembling fingers he pointed, not at Richard, but directly at Charles Whitmore. Charles Whitmore did not even glance at the trembling hand pointing toward him. Instead, he smiled, slow and controlled, as though the entire room had misunderstood what it had just witnessed. "A random muscle movement," he said evenly. "Nothing more." The fluorescent lights reflected across the stainless steel equipment as the heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, louder now against the suffocating silence. Richard looked from his father to Whitmore, then to Naomi. For the first time in years, certainty abandoned him. Naomi did not speak immediately. She stepped closer to the bedside and watched the old man's breathing. Each inhale came slightly deeper than before. Each exhale lingered just a fraction longer. Tiny changes. Easy to dismiss. Impossible for her to ignore. "He is trying again," she whispered. Whitmore's expression hardened. "Nurse Brooks, you have already disrupted this family enough." She kept her eyes on the patient. "No, sir. You are finished here." Richard finally raised a hand. "Nobody moves." His voice was quieter than before, but every person in the room obeyed. Whitmore turned slowly. Richard, your emotions are clouding your judgment. Richard did not answer. The billionaire who controlled boardrooms with a glance now looked like a frightened son searching for answers in places money could not reach. Naomi reached beneath the blanket and gently repositioned the old man's arm. Her fingertips paused over his wrist. She counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Then she looked toward the neurologist. Ask him a question with a yes or no answer. The physician hesitated. Mrs. Brooks? Please. After a long pause, he leaned toward the patient. Mr. Sterling, can you hear my voice? Nothing happened. Whitmore folded his arms, almost relieved. Several executives near the glass wall exchanged quiet whispers. One discreetly lifted a phone, the tiny camera lens catching the cold hospital lights. Richard lowered his head. Hope slipped away once again. Then Naomi spoke softly. Wrong question. Every face turned toward her. He has been hearing voices all week. She swallowed. Ask him something only he can choose. The neurologist frowned but nodded. He bent closer. Mr. Sterling, if you recognize your son, squeeze Nurse Brooks' hand once. The room stopped breathing. A long second passed. Then another. Suddenly, the old man's fingers tightened firmly around Naomi's hand. Gasps echoed across the suite. Richard covered his mouth. The neurologist stepped backward, stunned. Whitmore's confidence cracked for the first time. Coincidence? He muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Naomi looked directly at Richard. Talk to him now. Richard approached slowly until he stood beside the bed. His polished shoes reflected beneath the fluorescent lights. His hands shook visibly. Dad? His voice broke. I thought I had already lost you. The old man's eyelids fluttered but remained closed. His breathing steadied. Richard's tears fell silently onto the blanket. I should have come sooner. Another faint squeeze answered from beneath Naomi's fingers. The room dissolved into stunned silence. Even the executives who had doubted her lowered their eyes. Whitmore suddenly stepped forward. This ends now. His tone snapped through the room. Disconnect Nurse Brooks from this case immediately. Effective now. Every nurse froze. Nobody moved. Richard slowly lifted his head. You are removing the only person my father responds to? Whitmore straightened his tie. She has violated protocol repeatedly. She documented observations without sufficient clinical evidence. She created false expectations. If this becomes public, this hospital faces lawsuits. Naomi finally looked at him. There was sadness in her eyes, not fear. I documented exactly what I saw. Whitmore's jaw tightened. And nobody believed you. Naomi nodded once. Except him. She glanced toward the patient. Before anyone could answer, the bedside monitor emitted a sharp alert unlike any before. The screen shifted to a new neurological tracing. The neurologist rushed forward, his eyes widening with every second. He stared at the display, then at the patient, then back at Naomi. His voice barely escaped above a whisper. This pattern should not be possible. Richard turned toward the monitor, confusion replacing grief. Whitmore took one step backward. Then the neurologist looked directly at Richard and said the one sentence that drained every ounce of color from the administrator's face. Your father is trying to tell us something, and I think he has been trying to expose someone for days. The neurologist never took his eyes off the monitor. The jagged lines pulsing across the screen were no longer random. They appeared in deliberate clusters, repeating with impossible consistency. The cold fluorescent lights shimmered across the metal bed rails while the steady hiss of oxygen filled the suffocating silence. Richard stepped closer, his heartbeat pounding louder than the machines around him. What is he trying to say? He asked. The neurologist hesitated. I do not know yet. Whitmore did not wait. This has gone far enough. His voice rang through the suite. Disconnect the equipment. Clear the room. We are done. No one moved. Every nurse stood frozen. Every physician looked at someone else, unwilling to make the first decision. Naomi slowly reached toward the monitor without touching it. Her eyes followed each repeating pattern. She had watched these same tiny changes during countless overnight shifts, while everyone else dismissed them as noise. "He is repeating something," she whispered. Whitmore scoffed. "You are imagining meaning where there is none." Richard turned sharply. "Then explain why she keeps being right." Whitmore's jaw tightened. The executives outside the glass wall leaned closer. Several phones were openly recording now, their camera lenses reflecting tiny circles of white light. The administrator noticed them, and his breathing quickened. One viral video could destroy decades of carefully built reputation. "Turn those cameras off," he barked. Nobody listened. Naomi bent toward the old man again. Her voice remained calm despite every eye fixed upon her. "Mr. Sterling, if you are trying to warn your son, squeeze twice." A long pause followed. Richard clenched both fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then the old man's fingers tightened once, paused, and tightened again. Audible gasps swept through the room. One resident covered his mouth. Another physician stared at the monitor, as though seeing it for the first time. Whitmore took a slow step backward. "Coincidence?" he insisted again, but the words sounded empty now. Richard looked directly at Naomi. "What do you think he is warning me about?" Before she could answer, another sharp alarm echoed through the suite. The neurological tracing suddenly formed another repeating sequence. Naomi's eyes widened. She had seen this exact rhythm once before during specialized neurological training years earlier. Not words. Not random activity. A response pattern. "Doctor," she said quickly, "ask him names?" The neurologist understood immediately. He leaned close to the patient. "Is the person hurting you Richard?" No movement. "Is it one of your physicians?" Nothing. Sweat gathered beneath Whitmore's collar. His polished shoes shifted almost silently across the floor. The neurologist swallowed. His next question came slower. "Is it Charles Whitmore?" The old man's hand closed around Naomi's fingers with startling strength. Once. Twice. 3 times. The room exploded into whispers. Richard stared at the administrator in disbelief. "What does that mean?" Whitmore raised both hands. "This is absurd. A dying patient cannot testify." His voice cracked for the first time. Naomi did not look at him. She was watching the old man's eyes. Tiny movements beneath closed lids. Intentional. Fighting. "He is exhausting himself," she whispered. "He has been trying to tell us this for days." Richard turned toward Whitmore, years of unquestioned trust collapsing in seconds. "What are you hiding?" Whitmore forced a smile that fooled no one. "Nothing," the neurologist suddenly interrupted. "Wait." He zoomed into the electronic chart displayed beside the bed. His face slowly lost all color. He scrolled once, twice, then stopped. Every medication adjustment from the past week carried one digital authorization. Every denied neurological consultation. Every cancelled imaging order. Every override. The same electronic signature appeared over and over again. Charles Whitmore. The administrator lunged toward the computer. "That record is incomplete." Richard caught the screen before it could be closed. The executives outside the glass instantly recognized what they were seeing. Their whispers became frantic. Naomi remained beside the patient, gently holding his trembling hand. She could feel his pulse weakening beneath her fingertips. Then the old man gathered every ounce of strength he had left, opened his eyes for the first time in days, looked directly at Richard, and whispered one barely audible word that made Naomi's blood run cold. "Basement." The word lingered in the air long after the old man's lips stopped moving. "Basement." Nobody repeated it. Nobody dared. The steady alarms faded into a softer rhythm, leaving only the quiet pulse of the monitor, and the slow hiss of oxygen filling the room. Richard stood motionless beside the bed, staring at his father, as if the single word had cracked open a door he had forgotten existed. Naomi never looked surprised. She gently adjusted the blanket over the old man's shoulder, her movements calm, almost comforting, while every eye remained fixed on her. The fluorescent lights reflected across the chrome rails, turning the room cold and colorless. Outside the glass wall, the executives lowered their phones one by one. The excitement that had filled the hallway minutes earlier dissolved into uneasy silence. Charles Whitmore noticed it immediately. People were no longer watching him with confidence. They were watching Naomi. His throat tightened. "He is delirious," Whitmore said, but the sentence landed weakly. Nobody answered. Richard slowly turned toward him. "My father has not spoken in 5 days." His voice was quiet enough to be dangerous. He chose one word. "Why that one?" Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks with fingers that no longer felt steady. "Patients say many things during neurological recovery." Naomi finally spoke. "Not him." The room turned toward her again. She did not raise her voice. "For 3 nights, every time I mentioned your family, his heart rate stayed stable. Every time someone mentioned hospital administration, his breathing changed." The neurologist looked back at the electronic chart. Tiny fluctuations. Patterns everyone else had dismissed. Suddenly they no longer looked random. Richard frowned. "You noticed all that?" Naomi nodded once. "Because I was listening." Silence settled over the room again. Heavy. Uncomfortable. One young resident quietly whispered to another, "How did we miss it?" The older physician beside him did not answer. He simply stared at Naomi with an expression that had replaced skepticism with respect. Richard slowly lowered himself into the chair beside the bed. The leather creaked softly beneath his weight. He reached toward his father's hand but hesitated before touching it. "I spent years believing money solved everything," he murmured. "She spent 3 nights paying attention." Naomi looked away. She had not come for recognition. She had come because an old man deserved someone willing to hear what machines could not measure. Whitmore felt the room slipping away from him. Every quiet glance between doctors felt like another accusation. Every vibrating phone in someone's pocket sounded like another reporter learning his name. He took one careful step toward the door. Naomi noticed without moving her head. "Where are you going?" Whitmore stopped. "I have other patients." Richard rose immediately. "No." The single word echoed through the suite. It was not loud, but it carried the weight of every boardroom Richard Sterling had ever controlled. Whitmore forced another smile. "You cannot detain me." Richard's eyes never left him. "Maybe not." He looked toward hospital security standing near the entrance. "But they can ask you to stay until we understand why my father said that word." Nobody moved. Even security hesitated, uncertain which powerful man they should obey. Naomi quietly reached for the bedside chart resting beneath the monitor. She flipped through page after page with slow, deliberate movements. Her fingers suddenly stopped. A thin yellow sticky note, nearly hidden between 2 assessment forms, caught her attention. It had no signature. Only 4 handwritten words. She stared at it for several seconds before carefully removing it. Richard noticed the change in her expression. "What is it?" Naomi looked from the note to the old man sleeping peacefully at last. Her breathing slowed. The room seemed to grow even quieter. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the hospital windows. Nobody spoke. Nobody blinked. Finally, Naomi lifted her eyes toward Richard and whispered, "This is not his handwriting." Richard reached for the note with trembling fingers. Before he could unfold it completely, every light in the intensive care suite flickered once, then the entire floor went dark. Darkness swallowed the intensive care suite. A chorus of startled breaths replaced the soft hum of fluorescent lights, while the heart monitor switched to its emergency battery, each measured beep cutting through the blackness like a countdown. Someone whispered for maintenance. Another reached for a phone, and pale screens flickered to life across anxious faces. Richard instinctively reached toward the bed, but before he could take another step, Naomi's calm voice broke through the confusion. "Nobody touch him." She did not raise her voice. She did not panic. Somehow, everyone obeyed. The emergency lights finally blinked on, washing the room in a dim amber glow that reflected across stainless steel rails and exhausted eyes. Richard looked at Naomi. For the first time since they met, he was not seeing a nurse standing beside his father. He was waiting for her to tell him what to do. Whitmore noticed it too, and his face tightened. "This is exactly why hospitals follow protocol," he snapped. "Stand down, Nurse Brooks." Naomi ignored him. She carefully unfolded the yellow note beneath the emergency light. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, almost desperate. Richard stepped beside her. "What does it say?" Naomi stared for several silent seconds before answering. "It says, 'Do not trust basement records.'" Every sound in the room seemed to disappear. Even the monitor felt quieter. Whitmore took one involuntary step backward. Richard noticed immediately. "You knew about this note." "I have never seen it before," Whitmore replied too quickly. Richard's eyes narrowed. Naomi gently turned the note over. On the back was a faded patient identification sticker. She studied it, then looked toward the neurologist. "This barcode belongs to another chart." The physician took the paper from her trembling fingers and scanned the number with his tablet. His expression changed almost instantly. "This patient." He stopped speaking. "What?" Richard demanded. The neurologist swallowed. "This record was archived 2 years ago." Naomi remained perfectly still. "Show us the name." The physician slowly rotated the tablet toward Richard. His breathing caught. The archived patient was not a stranger. It was Richard's mother. The woman everyone believed had died naturally years before. Richard stared at the screen as memories rushed back without warning. Hospital visits. Administrative delays. Missing paperwork. Whitmore quietly edged toward the doorway again. This time Richard noticed. "Do not move!" His voice echoed through the dim room. Security officers exchanged uncertain glances before finally stepping into Whitmore's path. The administrator forced a smile that no longer reached his eyes. "This proves nothing." Naomi looked directly at him for the first time. "No." Her voice remained gentle. "But it explains why he kept saying basement." She turned back toward Richard. "Medical archives are usually stored below ground." Richard's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Every humiliation Naomi had endured replayed in his mind. Every warning dismissed. Every observation ignored. Every insult he had thrown at her now echoed louder than the machines around him. He lowered his head for a brief moment, unable to meet her eyes. "I should have listened," Naomi answered without triumph. "Your father never stopped trying to make you listen." The words landed harder than any accusation. Around them, the physicians no longer questioned her judgment. Residents who had doubted her now watched every movement she made. Even the executives outside the glass lowered their phones, no longer recording a scandal but witnessing something far rarer. Trust rebuilding itself in real time. The neurologist suddenly looked back at the tablet. "There is something else." His finger hovered over the archived record. "The file was accessed yesterday." Richard's head snapped upward. "By who?" Nobody spoke. The physician slowly turned the screen toward the room. One username appeared beside the access log. Charles Whitmore. The administrator closed his eyes for the briefest second. When he opened them again, the confidence that had protected him all afternoon was gone. Richard took one slow step toward him, but before anyone could speak, the old man's weak voice drifted through the amber light once more, barely louder than a breath. "Not alone." Naomi's eyes widened. She slowly turned toward the hallway outside the suite. Someone else was standing there, perfectly still, watching every second through the glass. Every head turned toward the figure beyond the glass. No one spoke. The soft amber emergency lights reflected across the polished corridor, casting long shadows over a woman standing perfectly still with a leather archive case pressed against her side. She did not run. She did not hide. She simply met Richard's eyes, then looked quietly toward Naomi. The room held its breath. The steady monitor no longer sounded frightening. It sounded patient. Richard felt his pulse slowing for the first time all day. "Who is she?" he asked. Naomi recognized the woman immediately. "Helen Cross," she answered softly. "She worked in medical records before she retired." Helen stepped inside, her shoes clicking gently against the floor. Years of silence weighed across her face. She glanced at Charles Whitmore, who could no longer hold her gaze. "I told you this day would come," she said quietly. Nobody interrupted. Even the executives outside the suite lowered their phones, sensing this was no longer about scandal. It was about truth. Helen placed the archive case onto a nearby table. The metal latch clicked open with startling clarity inside the silent room. She pulled out a stack of aging folders tied together with faded blue ribbon. "These were scheduled for destruction," she whispered. Richard stared at the dates printed across the covers. They reached back years. Some carried his father's name. Others carried his mother's. One folder bore a bright orange sticker reading "Administrative Hold." Helen looked toward Naomi before speaking again. "She was the only person who kept asking questions." Richard slowly turned. Naomi lowered her eyes. "I only asked because the records did not make sense." Helen nodded. Everyone else stopped asking. Charles Whitmore finally found his voice. "Those files were under legal review," Helen answered without anger. "No. They were hidden." The words settled over the room like snowfall. Nobody argued. The neurologist quietly opened one folder. Inside were handwritten nursing observations that never appeared in the official electronic record. Medication concerns. Requests for neurological consultations. Repeated notes recommending additional evaluations. Every one of them had been marked deferred. Richard felt his throat tighten. He looked at Naomi with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "You saw this?" She shook her head gently. "Not the files." She glanced toward his father. "I saw the people." Richard closed his eyes. Every insult he had spoken echoed inside him with unbearable clarity. Every moment he had dismissed her because of her uniform. Every time he had mistaken calmness for weakness. He stepped toward Naomi, stopping only a few feet away. The entire room watched. The billionaire who had commanded boardrooms and controlled billion-dollar acquisitions suddenly seemed unable to find simple words. Finally he spoke. "I judged you before I ever listened." Naomi said nothing. The silence itself felt kinder than any reply. Richard lowered his head. "I am sorry." Nobody in the room looked away. The apology was quiet, but it carried farther than any speech he had ever delivered. Naomi's expression never changed. There was no satisfaction in her face. No victory. Only compassion that somehow made Richard's regret even heavier. "Your father needed someone to hear him," she replied softly. "That was all." Around them, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Nurses who had once questioned her exchanged humbled glances. Residents who had ignored her observations now looked at her with open respect. Even the physicians unconsciously stepped aside, leaving Naomi nearest the bedside without anyone asking. The center of the room had changed. Power no longer belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the person who had quietly refused to stop listening. Richard gently reached for his father's hand again. This time he did not rush. This time he waited. The old man's fingers answered with the faintest squeeze. Tears finally rolled freely down Richard's face. Nobody pretended not to notice. Behind them, Helen slowly removed one final envelope from the bottom of the archive case. Unlike the others, it was sealed with red tape and addressed directly to Richard Sterling in his father's handwriting. The ink had faded with time, but the name was unmistakable. Helen looked at Naomi before placing it into Richard's trembling hands. "Your father told me," she whispered. "If the truth was ever found, this letter must be opened only after he woke up." The room fell completely silent as Richard stared at the sealed envelope, realizing the greatest truth of all might still be waiting inside. Richard stood motionless with the sealed envelope resting in both hands. The room no longer felt like an intensive care suite. It felt like a place where years of silence had finally decided to speak. The emergency lights faded as the main power quietly returned, bathing the room in a soft white glow that reflected gently across the polished bed rails. The harsh beeping that had filled the afternoon settled into a calm, steady rhythm. Nobody rushed anymore. Nobody raised a voice. Richard carefully broke the faded seal. The paper inside crackled softly in the silence. His father's handwriting was unmistakable. Older. Slightly unsteady. Yet every word carried the same quiet certainty. Richard read only the first sentence before his eyes blurred with tears. If you are reading this, then someone finally chose to listen instead of assume. His shoulders sank. He continued reading silently while every person in the room waited. No cameras flashed now. Phones slowly lowered. Even the executives beyond the glass stood without speaking. Richard finally looked up. His voice barely carried across the room. My father wrote that truth survives only when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. He swallowed hard before turning another page. He wrote about Nurse Brooks. Naomi looked surprised for the first time. Richard smiled through tears that no longer embarrassed him. He said the young nurse with kind eyes reminded him that dignity is measured by character, never by title. Naomi lowered her gaze. She had never known he was awake enough to remember her face. Richard folded the letter carefully and stepped toward her. The billionaire who had once ordered her out of the room now stopped a respectful distance away. Miss Brooks. His voice was steady. I cannot undo how I treated you. Naomi met his eyes quietly. No. But I can make sure I never become that man again. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Richard extended his hand. Not as a billionaire. Not as a donor. Simply as a son who had finally learned humility. Naomi accepted the handshake with the same calm grace she had carried from the beginning. Around them, the physicians watched in complete silence. Nobody applauded. Somehow that made the moment even more powerful. The neurologist quietly removed Naomi's handwritten observation notes from the temporary file and placed them inside the official medical record. Without saying a word, he signed his own name beneath hers. One resident followed. Then another physician. One after another, signatures appeared beneath the notes everyone had once ignored. Across the room, hospital security approached Charles Whitmore. This time no one argued. The administrator glanced once toward Naomi before lowering his head and walking away without another word. His polished shoes echoed down the hallway until even those footsteps disappeared. Richard returned to his father's bedside. The old man slowly opened his eyes again. They were tired but peaceful. Richard gently squeezed his hand. I heard you this time. His father answered with the faintest smile. It was enough. Morning sunlight gradually pushed through the hospital windows, replacing the cold artificial glow with warm gold stretching across the floor. The night of accusations, fear, and pride quietly gave way to something gentler. Naomi checked the intravenous line one last time, adjusted the blanket over the old man's shoulder, and prepared to leave for the next patient waiting down the hall. Richard watched her reach the doorway. Miss Brooks. She turned. He searched for words worthy of the moment, but only one sentence remained. Thank you for listening, when I never did. Naomi smiled softly. Sometimes people do not need louder voices. She glanced back toward the father and son. They just need someone willing to stay. She walked into the bright morning corridor, her footsteps light against the polished floor, disappearing among nurses beginning another ordinary shift. Behind her, no one saw a servant anymore. They saw the woman whose quiet courage had restored a family, uncovered the truth, and changed a room full of powerful people without ever raising her voice. The sunlight lingered on the empty doorway long after she was gone, while inside the room a billionaire sat beside his father in grateful silence, finally understanding that the strongest person there had never been the one with the most power, but the one who chose to listen.